Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Happy Founding Fathers Weekend. Well, it's Father's Day weekend, and why apply just one type of father to it? Let's talk founding fathers. Let's talk lots of different things. And home to so many of the founding fathers, Virginia has currently slipped. I remember when it was much higher ranked on the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Analysis. One of the authors of the annual analysis of economic freedom, Dean Stansel, is on with us. Dean, welcome back to the program. Happy Father's Day weekend. I hope you're having a great weekend, and thank you for taking some time out with us.
Absolutely. Thanks, and same to you, Joe.
Now, Virginia has fallen to sixth on the economic freedom rankings over the last few years. I remember it's been as high as 2 and 1 on that list over time. First, I want to get into the erosion and how it slid down a little bit. Certainly, 6 out of 50 is quite good, but what impact Medicaid expansion may have on it will be the second part of where we are. But how does a state get, number one, as high ranked as we are, number two, slide back from being 1 or 2, and then we'll from there go into Medicaid expansion?
Sure, yeah. So the important thing to keep in mind here is we grade on a curve. So we kind of grade each state relative to each other. So there are a variety of things that can affect your ranking. If you're standing still and everyone else is moving forward, then of course you're going to fall behind. So that can matter. Of course, if you're doing things that are reducing economic freedom, that's going to matter. And as you said, look, Tennessee is up there pretty high. Tennessee as well. That's the one I was going to contrast you with. Virginia's up there really high and has been for quite some time. Yeah, they slipped a little bit, but 6 out of 50, it's not too bad. The only, I was looking at your neighboring states on the map just a minute ago, and Tennessee is the only one that's ranked higher, and they're one spot higher at 5th. One of the things that, to compare you to Tennessee, that Tennessee does right, that Virginia gets wrong, and I actually did a report for Virginia Institute a couple of years ago on this, on the tax system, and that is that Tennessee doesn't tax labor income at all. There's no income tax there, and Virginia has a relatively high income tax, top income tax rate, and that really can make a difference for businesses trying to decide where to locate, looking at what kind of taxes their big high earners are going to have to pay.
I think I remember that report, and some of Virginia's issues with our tax system also go into maybe intransparency is too hyperbolic, but the fact that there are a lot of things that may add into what may be a relatively reasonable Virginia overall tax, but they come from a lot of places, fees and hidden costs embedded in things as well, correct?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. That happens in a lot of places. But Joe, one of the important elements to any sort of recipe for economic success when it comes to tax reform is that you want your income taxes to be as low as possible, because those are essentially a penalty on productivity. Sure. And in contrast, while we don't want any taxes to be overly high, sales taxes don't tend to put that sort of damage on the economy. And so a recipe for success would be something like Texas and Florida do, where you have no income tax, but rather you have relatively high sales taxes. And this has proven itself pretty well in recent years in terms of economic growth in those areas. Companies pulling out of states like California and Illinois and moving to Texas and Florida. And so in that context, Virginia gets it exactly backwards, because their income tax rate is relatively high. It's about middle of the pack nationwide, but still for a state ranked 6th, that's pretty bad. And on sales taxes, they're ranked very high in terms of having a low sales tax burden, ranked 7th in the last report overall. So that really needs to be reversed, and that was one of the things that report I mentioned focused on, that a way to go about reforming the tax code is cut those income taxes, preferably get rid of it, and if you need to hike the sales tax a little bit to make up for the difference, then that's going to be better off. That's going to make the economy better off.
Dean, one of the things you also mentioned at the onset was the fact is remaining static is not good to your ranking if you just everything stays the same. And one of the things I do recall years ago that had Virginia highly ranked was the fact that we were a rarity in the country with being a right-to-work state, and certainly one of the furthest north right-to-work state. And that has changed a lot. I believe, if last time I looked, right-to-work states are almost 50%, if not right around 50% of the states in the union now?
That sounds right. I was doing a report for a group in Missouri on this just recently. I just wrote on this. Let's see if I can grab it real quick here. I think it's 33 now have find
Wow.
it. Anyway, yeah, it is. Yeah. I believe it's over half now because there have been a number of prominent states recently, like Wisconsin and Minnesota, that have moved in that direction. So yeah, it's an important. It's a in the context of what you were saying. Yes, it's a less important element relatively because everyone else is doing it also. But it is nevertheless an important reform to keep in place and not try to get rid of it or anything. But it has less impact over time as others follow suit.
So without necessarily looking at the whys, I want to get into the now introduction of Medicaid expansion, not just for Virginia, but as it refers to some of the states that had tried it over the last 5 years since it's been put forth as a plank in Obamacare. Dean Stansel of the Fraser Institute, one of the authors of their Economic Freedom Index, and you can look at it online, FraserInstitute.org, and it's a great map. You can even go back in history, look at economic freedom numbers from the 80s and on through to today. Dean, so Medicaid expansion happens for whatever debatable reasons. The Virginia General Assembly and the Republicans there decided that for the last 5 years they were apparently wrong to tell us that Medicaid expansion was a bad idea and now is okay. So hypothetically, what kind of impact can it have on Virginia, especially based on the impact it's had on some of the states that have already tried it?
Sure. Two quick points I want to clarify before I get to that. Number one, I don't technically work for the Fraser Institute. I work with them on this report, but they have a great new website. I don't think you mentioned this, but just in case, at freetheworld.com. It's an interactive map where you can click on your state, and it'll show you all lots of bells and whistles compared to just looking at a printed report. And I'm at the O'Neill Center at SMU in Dallas at Southern.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I just know.
I've been working with Fraser for about 5 years now, and I do this report for them every year. And it is a big project, but technically I'm not.
And go Mustangs, SMU.
That's
great
right.
university.
Go
Mustangs. But certainly appreciated.
Football-wise. Okay, so to Medicaid expansion. So you're right. There have been a good number of states that have already done this, and I believe maybe that's where the 33 that was stuck in my head is coming from. Yeah, Virginia's the 33rd state to expand under Obamacare. Mm-hmm. One of the pretty much universal things that these previous expanding states have seen is that their cost estimates, their sign-up estimates in terms of who's signing up, new sign-ups to Medicaid, have been way, way under. I mean, in some cases, the costs have been twice as high. The cost increases and the enrollment increases have been twice as high as they expected. Wow. So the idea that this is free money that's going to just solve all of our problems, I think is a bit far-fetched, and people ought to really look at the evidence from the other states that have tried this. Learn from others' mistakes. It's a nice rule to follow in general, especially when it comes to public policy. Another important point here, I think, is that when you look at the system of Medicaid and you compare it, say, to a private system, look, we're kind of funneling people into a system that doesn't work very well. It's kind of my point. So we're expanding a poor system, and that may not be the best way to go if you really, truly you're trying to help the people who are without coverage and without health care benefits. And there are other ways to go about this. In other states that have done this, they've seen people, of course, move out of private insurance into Medicaid. And in my view, quality-wise, that's a step down.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had mentioned the enrollment numbers, the return money. Much of the campaign for Medicaid expansion here in Virginia has been based around, I believe it was David Toscano, the House Minority Leader, a Democrat from Charlottesville, was frequently saying, we're just getting our money back. We've already sent that money to Washington. This is just our way of getting it back. It sounds like what you're saying is that doesn't pencil out, does it?
Well, it doesn't necessarily. Now, certainly in the short run, the costs are in a sense covered by federal revenues. Now, of course, Virginians pay federal taxes, so you're paying your population-wise share of that, greater than 1/50th, because Virginia's kind of an above-average size state, I think. But the problem is that in the long run, right, there's no binding commitment here. Whatever Congress decides to do in the long run about these commitments is up in the air. They can kind of pull out and say, sorry, you're on your own. You've got to pay all of this. And frankly, if you look at the way the federal budget is trending, with about 2/3 of the budget going to entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, it's a growing problem that needs to be addressed eventually. Now, I'm not confident that the current leadership on either side of the aisle will do anything about it in the short term, but ultimately there comes a time where you hit a credit limit, right?
Yeah.
Just like a consumer, you hit a credit limit and you can't borrow anymore, right? We're trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, where our debt to GDP ratio is close to 100%, and at some point people will stop being willing to buy our government debt, and at that point we're going to be in big trouble.
Well, Dean Stansel from SMU and one of the co-authors of the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Report, you mentioned the federal support of it. Mick Mulvaney from the Office of Management and Budget sent as a message to Virginia via first text message, and I guess then contacted the General Assembly directly and said, I wouldn't bank the mortgage on there being any, never mind the 90% support that the federal government was promising, which, of course, a couple of years ago was 100%, and many people like you and I had said, nah, don't count on that being 100%. Then it went down to 95, and then it went to 90, and Mulvaney has certainly sent signals that it could be as low as 0% very soon, because he said there's just not the money in the federal budget for it. Where is the state going to have to turn then? You already said our income tax is very high. Do they go after more income tax? Do they go after a sales tax, since that sort of will, collect money from all the people as a consumption tax? What do you think, and what have other states done?
Well, one of the fortunately for state budget makers, one of the things that's happened in the last year or so is that with the economy increasing, in terms of economic growth increasing, a lot of states have seen revenues come in faster than expected. So you've got a lot of states with pretty flush revenue coffers, and in some ways, that's bad for economic freedom, in the sense that all that money sitting there ultimately it usually ends up getting spent. And what states really need to avoid that problem is some sort of spending growth cap. Like Colorado has one that limits it to population growth plus inflation. Something that requires them to have discipline on spending in general will help across the board with when things come up, like you get all of a sudden a huge increase in Medicaid costs. And Medicaid costs have been going up anyway quite substantially.
Oh, yeah.
So this would only make that part worse. What the solution is, that's for politicians to decide. I mean, in my opinion, as I said, I think that they ought to cut the income tax. Now, that's not going to solve the problem necessarily, but it will help the economy. And then if you bump up the sales tax a bit, then especially if you do it via local option and allow the local governments to have some control and compete with each other about how high taxes should be, it might be a way to go about dealing with this. But ultimately, you got to scale back somewhere, right? If you're going to ramp up spending on Medicaid, then you got to cut back somewhere else, and that's where politicians have to have some discipline, and it's not a common characteristic.
Well, no, and I've certainly seen the hostage situations involving school kids and law enforcement, and give us higher taxes or we're going to shut down the rest areas or something like that in Virginia. You had mentioned, since the other part of the campaign for this is we need to care for people who are on the margins, and I've looked at some of the numbers, and this expands Medicaid well onto what Virginians would consider reasonable people to view as the middle class. Is this just an incrementalist view towards getting eventually everyone used to having the government take care of this, and then just saying, hey, let's just do single payer along the line? Because the standard really brings a lot of people under the Medicaid umbrella that never would have even imagined that they were Medicaid eligible before.
Right. No, that's an excellent point, that this is one of those gradual movements towards some sort of single payer system, which I would be strongly opposed to. But yeah, I think that's another reason to be careful about how we go about dealing with this move to expand Medicaid, and try to resist it a bit more than apparently the folks in the Virginia legislature did. And by the way, on the Economic Freedom Report we were talking about earlier, so we break the things down. There's 10 different variables. I was looking at it just a minute ago before we came on air, and there's one of the variables that the one on which Virginia does the worst, right? Virginia's 6th overall. They're 32nd for transfers and subsidies spending.
Ooh.
And we measure this as a percent of income to compare across states. So they're already spending a lot more money, kind of shifting money around to basically writing checks to different people, including people of lower income, people who are old, people who are in particularly favored industries, that sort of thing. So they're already behind the curve on that one. And this is only going to make that worse and drive their ranking down further in the coming years.
You had also mentioned, I think this is important from the humanitarian side, because I think you and me and anyone who espouses conservatism or membership in any of the think tank organizations like the Virginia Institute for Public Policy or the Fraser Institute, we can often be said, oh, you're just cold think tankers and conservatives don't care about people. I do care, as I believe you do as well. And you talked about how Medicaid expansion has exposed all the poor parts of the system. 2 decades ago, it was common to say, oh, Medicaid runs so much more efficiently than your average insurance company. That's until you expand the roles, and we see all the flaws in the system where you have very few doctors who accept Medicaid. Many doctors have gotten out of the system, but it's also very, very hard to get full payment on things, and people are winding up with medical bills that they didn't expect to have because Medicaid didn't wind up covering what they thought they were covering. Is that all part and parcel that we should be thinking about from a humanitarian standpoint?
Sure. And I'm really more of a libertarian than a conservative, but we're all in the same boat in some ways on this issue. And the idea here is that, yes, we definitely want to help those who are in need, and there are a variety of ways to do that. And if you look at the Medicaid system as it exists, it's basically fairly well known for having poor health care quality, lesser outcomes. The system essentially is already broken. It's got a limited pool of doctors, and you add more people to it, it's only going to increase the strain. And I think that the way we need to go is to expand access to private health insurance, and there are a variety of ways you can do that. Certainly the movement towards plans that have relatively high deductibles but therefore relatively low premiums can help put the consumer more in charge of their own cost, and these sorts of things can work well for people at lower income levels. There's a service I saw just recently. There are a lot of these services where doctors are only taking not taking insurance at all anyway, right? Mm-hmm. Only taking a private fee, cash payment, or check, credit card. Yeah. And one of the things that's helping in terms of transparency is that consumers can shop around by price. Right, because normally you go to the doctor, if you've got insurance, you pay your copay, and no one really cares what the cost is. It's all passed on through your premiums to everyone else as well as you. And so one of the ways we can help with that is to switch to a system where people are a little more conscious of what they're doing. And I saw another thing that's helpful for that kind of group of people who are either underinsured or uninsured. There's this new system, and I forgot the name of it, where you it's a subscription service where you as a patient, you post, here's the service I need, and then providers, doctors bid on providing that service to you, and it's a way to make things a little more transparent in terms of cost, but also try to give the incentive to keep costs down, which really doesn't exist in a single payer program or any sort of third party payer. The incentive to keep costs down is pretty restrained.
We have several of those folks right in our flagship city of Charlottesville that do that. It's sort of like Travelocity for medical care. Find somebody who's got some free time and see what they'd be willing to do it for. But also, ironically, just the year before we expanded Medicaid, Terry McAuliffe signed in a law that allows for direct primary care associations like Atlas Medical and some of the ones you were mentioning before, where you just a little bit every month and you just have a membership card, like being part of Costco. And that's fair as well. But as you said, once you expand into the middle class, it seems like you're pushing the lower ends out even more. Are there states, real quick, before we finish up, Dean, have you noticed any states that are, 5 years into a Medicaid expansion, maybe did it right off the bat, jumped in feet first, that are trying to get out of it? Are there any examples of states that are now trying to get themselves out of it, or are just looking at higher taxes and lower standards for Medicaid expansion?
Yeah, so I did read something on this by the Foundation for Government Accountability, and they mentioned a couple of states, I believe it was Michigan and Arkansas, who are trying to roll back and say, stop, this isn't working right. And in terms of the details, I'm not really positive about that. But yeah, there's definitely a movement amongst some of these states that were early expanders who are seeing the sorts of cost overruns that I talked about earlier. And look, at the state level, you got to balance your budget, right? It's not like the feds in Congress where they can just spend without limit. These guys are seeing the cost overruns and have to do something about it because they've got to balance their budget. And so one of the things they're trying to do is scale back on some of this stuff. And work requirements are a thing that's becoming more common, requesting waivers for that sort of thing, which can help as well.
Well, Dean, I do appreciate your visit with us, and at some point I want to talk about some of the other things you're working on because you've got some great reports and projects out there. But for now, we will have to part ways, and I hope you have a great Father's Day weekend and enjoy Texas. I see Texas, by the way, for those who are wondering, is ranked number 2 on the most recent.
That's right. That's right. And by the way, I've got a local version of the Economic Freedom Index coming out later this summer with the Reason Foundation. So,
really?
I'll have to let you know about that, and maybe we can come on and talk about it.
You mean local, like
metro area? Yeah. So looking at Charlottesville versus Richmond versus D.C.
Oh yes, we would definitely be interested in that, Dean. So yeah, pencil us onto your calendar already, and of course we love the folks at the Reason Foundation as well. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks. Same to you, Joe.
And thank you for tuning in this week. Coming up next, from one of the founding fathers, not of the United States, but of the House Freedom Caucus, Tim Huelskamp, insights on social media and conservatism. And do you have a right to Twitter? I have a million questions about this. Social media and conservatism with Tim Huelskamp next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine, Tertium Quids. You know, you've heard the stories about it. Find us online at tertiumquids.org. Joining us now from the Heartland Institute, their president, former member of the House Freedom Caucus and the U.S. House of Representatives, the Honorable Tim Huelskamp. Tim, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing this morning, sir, and thanks for joining us.
We are doing great at the Heartland Institute. Thanks for having me on your show.
We miss you in the House, and it seems like very quietly, and perhaps this is the stuff of a James Patterson novel, the House Freedom Caucus is missing, could be his next one, because we're losing Congressman Tom Garrett. Hopefully we can replace him with somebody, but it seems like the Freedom Caucus members are, they get targeted by sometimes the big government types, and we appreciate the fact that you found a way to perhaps even have more impact there at the Heartland Institute.
Well, there are folks and conservatives might miss me in the House, but there's plenty in the establishment that is very glad that I'm gone, which is a sign of making a difference. But pleasure to be on and using our big megaphone at the Heartland Institute. Not only do we work in Washington, D.C. on issues and international issues as well on the climate side, but we work in every state legislature fighting for freedom every year, and we think we're making a lot of progress outside of the Beltway.
Well, and even despite the marshaled hordes against conservative thought, I've had this raging debate over time regarding social media, and it is one of those places where I think there's certainly a volatile argument regarding, what is fair play versus what is a constitutional right, what is free speech issues. But you guys at the Heartland Institute have put together a beautiful open letter to the social media group owners and signed by so many greats like Brent Bozell and yourself, obviously, and Ken Cuccinelli and Tony Perkins and Ed Meese. These folks, you've all marshaled together to call for fairer social media policies. And Tim, I wanted to jump in on the first one, which is actually the third one, I believe, in your letter, in which you talk about the First Amendment. Actually, it's the fourth item here. And tech giants should afford their users nothing less than the free speech and free exercise of religion embodied in the First Amendment. And it seems like you're making the case that they are like a store anywhere. They may be a private company, but they're open to the public. Therefore, the Constitution holds sway over whatever they might concern themselves with being their private property.
Well, we think the First Amendment should hold sway even if they aren't seen in a public accommodation in that sense. But the letter was led by Media Research Center Brent Bozell, and happy to join him and about 60 other conservatives. But at the end of the day, if your business model, if you're social media and your business model is anti-business or anti-conservative, it's going to fail. Mm-hmm. And what we're trying to do is get the message out that there is deliberate outright bias and censorship of conservatives in these social media accounts and these social media platforms, whether it's Twitter and Facebook and Google and YouTube especially, and there's no doubt. But as you can see in the legacy, the old print media, they're dying because of that failed business model. Mm-hmm. And if conservatives leave these platforms, they go away. And they will lose, and that's one thing we're trying to do is raise the flag of freedom, and talk about First Amendment. And again, but if you pronounce yourselves in social media that you're an open platform, you're essentially lying to folks, as Project Veritas has exposed. Mm-hmm. They deserve to be exposed, and I think we're seeing the folks in the social media world, starting to get nervous. Actually, I will be in a meeting later this week talking with one of the key executives, and they're looking for an answer. The answer is just open it up and do what you proclaim to be, and that's an open platform for thought. Because at the end of the day, as conservatives, we believe we have the right answers, and we're ready to go out in the public arena and defend those. But when we're silenced, and when the so-called truth tellers at these social media giants are 12-1, liberals versus conservatives, they know they can't win. That's why they're trying to shut us down. And as conservatives, what we're trying to do is make certain folks understand that there's this systematic censorship and bias against conservatives, and it should stop now.
Well, and that's certainly, I think, the most interesting part of this is being publicly traded companies in many of these cases. They're all facing an enormous backlash from their own investors if they're not careful with this. And the bad PR that a fellow like James O'Keefe will bring to you through Project Veritas certainly redoubles that. Is that one of the concerns that maybe, to paraphrase a hip-hop song, bring the boys to the yard, as it were, when it comes to allowing for conservative discussions on an equal playing field and not watering them down?
Well, I think it should be. But again, if that's your business model, that you're going to attack those that have the money, which are generally conservatives, and attack businesses and attack our free enterprise system, you may not do well. Just ask the New York Times how that business plan is working out to go after those that actually drive the economy. But at the end of the day, I can see where you're sitting in California out in the middle of on the left coast in the Silicon Valley and think that's what everybody else thinks. Mm-hmm. So it's part of our reason for the letters to shake them up, and wake up conservatives across there. If we have to find another platform, let's do that. But I've been just like you, Joe. I'm sure put out a tweet or a message on Facebook like, well, wait a minute, nobody's really responded to that. And then we hear from Project Veritas that shadow banning's going on where frankly, you put out a tweet and Twitter says, no, we don't want anybody else to see that. So that will be a failed business model, whether or not they see it now or whether they see it next year or 2 years from now. The technology is going to overrun these guys, and they ought to get up. And if you mirror the First Amendment, that's all we're asking. Just give us equal access, and then we'll take the debate after that.
And when you look at the town square that social media has become, imagine a place where people would be allowed to keep people from the town square in, say, the 18th century as this country was founding, or even draw back to the Stamp Act and trying to quell some of the bloggers of that day like Thomas Paine. It's chilling to see that. Do you feel, and certainly James has found that the companies for their own politics are behind a lot of it, but are there other actors in there from, as you said, some of this deep state, some of the big government, both Republicans and Democrats in Washington, that these folks feel like if they are dragged in front of the government oversight, that for the most part it'll be ignored either because they're helping him out in national security concerns, or that enough Republicans join with the far left Democrats to agree that some of these voices should be quieted?
Well, the national security concerns, I will tell you, as a former member of Congress, I am worried about how these tech giants do share information with the government. And you raise a real concern that given they provide backdoor access to private accounts of tens and hundreds of millions of law-abiding Americans, you got to worry that they get something in exchange for that access. But it's really hard to get into their mind what their business model is. But what we are asking for as conservatives is pretty clear. And I think most Americans would agree. Let's mirror the First Amendment. Let's be transparent. Let's define hate speech and provide equal footing for conservatives. But we're just beginning, I think, the exposure of what is going on in there. But don't forget, if it wasn't for Twitter, honestly believe, Hillary Clinton would be president today. So here are these leftist companies with their boardrooms populated by leftists. Their employees generally are leftists. They employ leftists and haters on the left to attack conservatives on social media and silence us by calling us hateful and hate speech. At the end of the day, though, they gave rise to Donald Trump. And so they're in a tough world.
Yeah, that's true.
One thing they're relying on, though, is our belief that the government isn't the answer. So, of course, today is the first day that net neutrality is gone. And that's one of these things where a perversion of the word and perversion of the idea that somehow the government's going to come in and determine fair speech. At the end of the day, that is the complete polar opposite of what our founders intended and what the First Amendment believes. So what conservatives hadn't done is demanded, Donald Trump to shut down these platforms. What we've done is demanded equal access and do that in the public sphere and also then recognize and with the possible threat that conservatives will find other ways to get our message out. But in the meantime, we're taking on the biases of these social media giants.
Well, and calling them out for what it is. And I, having started my radio career more than just a couple of days ago, I remember having to work under what then was laughably called the Fairness Doctrine until the mid-'80s, when that went away, and how it was actually weaponized against speech because you could silence your critics by just not agreeing to come on to be the counterpoint to their statement. So it was actually doing just the opposite. Tim Huelskamp of the Heartland Institute, president thereof, and one of the signatories on this open letter, Conservatives Urging Fair Social Media Policies, Media Research Center, and Project Veritas, Ed Meese, Ken Cuccinelli, some of the great folks who have signed on to this, Frank Gaffney, all these folks putting their name behind this. Tim, you talk about in this, and I think this is one of the more compelling parts of this open letter, which is the clarity on hate speech. Is this something, and maybe to use the phrase weaponization, if you weaponize speech against somebody, like a softball bat is a perfectly fine athletic implement until you weaponize it against somebody else, then it becomes, where I grew up, an assault weapon. So is that really what we should be looking at? Not so much what's being said, but how speech is being used against people?
Well, I think that's part of it, but we do know the social media giants with Twitter, Facebook, Google, and the YouTube platform specifically have pulled together a bunch of leftists to determine what's hate speech. And we know from our universities all across America what is really speech to them, and the truth to them is what they call hate speech. So there's this tremendous reach on social media, and which is different than when our founders wrote the First Amendment and demanded it be part of the Constitution. But the reach and the impact and how they can shut him down. I mean, they could shut Thomas Paine down in a heartbeat. All they have to do is shadow ban him today and silence him. So, but what is great about this is we had 60 conservative leaders pulling together and saying enough is enough, to make sure our conservatives across America understand what is going on. It is systematic social media censorship. And we have to get our message out any way we can. But again, you still have this case where social media created the weapon for Donald Trump to push back against the establishment and both parties and say enough is enough. And so every day, if I was at Twitter every day, I wonder, well, I'd be here tomorrow. And I suspect if they continue down the path of censorship of conservatives, they will disappear, and rightfully so in a free market of ideas. But you don't have to go very far outside the United States to see what happens when the government runs a social media system. You go to China and plenty of these other countries where autocrats reign and there's no freedom of expression. We don't want to head there. We don't want the government in charge, but we want to make certain that there's open access, and that's why we released this letter rather than going and filing a lawsuit and demanding President Trump engage and start doing something called net neutrality. It's the complete opposite. It's freedom of expression and freedom of thought that I think is part and parcel of our American system.
Tim, you remind me of that day during the Arab Spring when Hosni Mubarak shut down Twitter in Egypt, and President Obama at one moment was saying how bad it was, but then actually wistfully lets out a little secret where he kind of wonders if it wouldn't be a bad thing for him to try to do. A nice little window into the thinking in Washington. And that being said, though, I asked this question at the Consumer Electronics Show, and the reaction was somewhat like what happens when you break wind in church. But I had asked a panel at the Consumer Electronics Show if these companies who seem to profit off of the readership of their sites, Twitter, Facebook, the number of folks using it, and they look upon so much of their activity as content providers. At what point do they become like a publishing company like Time Magazine or Newsweek, where they have to be at least liable for what they publish? Because I wonder if it's not the other direction, where these organizations not having to become liable for what they publish can publish all sorts of egregious and erroneous facts without any sort of recourse, because they're this aggregator that's given a hall pass on liability for what I view anyway as publishing falsehood.
Well, they're aggregators of everything that they like, But this claim that they're an open access, an open platform, I mean, that's what we see in some congressional hearings. That's what this letter has revealed. That's what my friends at Project Veritas have exposed. Is that's not really the case. I mean, this is again the next effort of the left to silence their opposition. Under the Obama administration, they were going to have bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. impose this. That didn't happen. And these same tech companies are doing this internally as well. But some are reaching back. You have a meeting later this week with one of these key companies of folks who signed this letter saying, gosh, what can we do? Well, it's pretty simple. But the problem I think I see is just the culture of these folks. I mean, they don't have a conservative that works there. That's what Project Veritas exposed. If they do, they get rid of them. And the message out to them is, wait a minute. The same mass of folks who turned Washington upside down with Donald Trump have now told you better allow access to your social media platforms, or you're going to go the way of plenty of other tech giants that no longer exist. And so I think it's really a good, healthy sign still that in our American system, we can stand up to those that control access everywhere and think we have enough power that they're not going to shut us down. But they're systematically, censorship bias is at a crisis level. And we have to push now, or if they do get their way, who knows how quickly they could really shut out any dissenting thought from of the left.
Tim Huelskamp on with us, talking about the end of net neutrality, but also a letter to the owners of these social media giants, the CEOs, Twitter, Facebook, Google, YouTube, and you talk about providing transparency. You say, we need detailed information so everyone can see if liberal groups and users are being treated the same as those on the right. Who would be because the worst thing I can think of is starting a government commission. Like, we have all of these congressional oversight committees that I wonder if they're not half the problem, Tim. And you can certainly figure out how to game a bureaucracy. Is it something you want the FCC overseeing or the SEC? Or who should be watching this as a watchdog for the transparency?
Well, I think our customers, arbiters, should be the American people, and not the bureaucrats or the politicians in Washington, who almost all of them have a biased interest. And so that's what we're asking is, okay, Google, tell us what your policies are. is what we've seen exposed on Project Veritas and plenty of others. Is that your actual policy? And that what was interesting is when when that story came out from Veritas, very few knew about it because the tech companies shut that down.
Yeah,
and that is a perfect example of what's going on. But we do have a few outlets where you can stand up. You can go on Fox News and some of other places. We can go to our own loyal followers at Heartland and dozens and dozens of other groups. But the arbiters should be the American people. And again, just don't forget what must be going on in their boardrooms, what must be going on in their company offices. Wait a minute, Donald Trump won because of us.
Yeah.
So they are searching for, well, what did we do wrong? I mean, at the end of the day, though, don't forget, for many of these people, it's not about making money. They're trying to change and force their leftist ideology down our throats. And so it might not just be about, changing them as a company and how they deal with customers. The challenge should be there'll be alternative ways to get the message out. And that's the great thing that I'm so hopeful about is just technology. These folks think they can shut us down. They thought they could shut us down with 3 broadcast media sources that said the same thing every night on evening news for how many decades. And those folks are gone. They're desperately trying to stay in business. New York Times is about gone. And at the end of the day, if the social media giants that we know of today don't change their way, they will disappear like those in the past.
I agree, and I think that's where they have to be an honest broker to their own shareholders. If you have stock in Google and you're thinking you're ready to retire, you've got to be worried that at some point they go the way of MySpace in it, because there are other search engines out there, and there's other ways to search for information, and certainly Google feels like they've cornered the market in that. But there was a world before Google, and there will be a world after it if they're not careful.
They will disappear. I don't know when, but it will happen. That's the ingenuity of our system, unless you have net neutrality. And that's the whole purpose of government regulation, is to freeze everything in place so the same old guys and gals get the same old access, and the rest of the world, the real people, the flyover country, get the leftovers or crumbs, as Nancy Pelosi calls it. So technology is a friend of our side, and that's why the left is always opposed technological leaps that we see as innovations. And so I'm very hopeful for the future. And at the end of the day, we're going to beat them, whether they're going to be with us or against us. We either replace them or they'll actually become more transparent and more customer friendly. But again, they shouldn't take on the the New York Times business model, which is anti-business. Yeah, it just doesn't work out for them. But one thing Heartland can tell you, especially on the climate side, we have literally dozens and dozens of businesses that work against their own interests, like ExxonMobil, for example, and BP, and plenty of other companies that are actually, for example, on the climate side, have already says, oh yeah, it is a fact that quote unquote we're polluting the climate and destroying the atmosphere and those kind of things. That is not true, but they've taken that position, which is actually hurting their stockholders.
Oh, I know.
Same one for a Google stockholder. Why would you want to invest in a company that tells one half of the America to go fly a kite? At the end of the day, that won't last, and it's costing you money every day. So, yeah, we're hoping shareholders and folks in the corporate boardroom say, wait a minute, you mean this is going to impact our bottom line? Sure. Absolutely.
Well, one of our favorites, former UVA professor Michael Mann, as we speak, is holding a conference in Charleston, West Virginia, where the Senate race has managed to convince even a borderline centrist Democrat like Joe Manchin to run towards nationalizing coal, power plants and nuclear power plants, or at least call for it. And he's out there saying, I challenge all my opposers to come in. And of course, he'll sit up on the stage and then, belittle whoever's set out there as a plant for it. But it's amazing to watch how the narrative can be swung the other way. But that's what it is. It is as, I forget, the national security advisor under Obama talked about the Iran nuclear deal, said we just had to fire up the echo chamber. And after a little bit, we had public support for it, and that's what they do.
Well, and there certainly is that capability in the current infrastructure of social media, in which government actors and other leftists can misuse the power of persuasion in a manner was never at all possible beforehand.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's that existential threat to those of us who believe in freedom, that the government has the monopoly on coercion. And as we mentioned at the beginning, what are they doing for national security interest? What are they sharing with the government, our information?
Yep.
And so I'm worried about that. And at the same time, also worried about what they're hiding from us about our views of our fellow Americans. And so happy to work with dozens of other conservatives. We're not only out to make a point, we're out to make a change and make certain that social media platforms in their conservative bias stop the bias now and give us a free shot, open access with our ideas.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what Al Gore says about inventing the internet these days, Tim. I appreciate your visit from the Heartland Institute president and the Honorable Tim Huelskamp. Tim, thank you so much for your time this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe.
And find them at heartland.org. And we thank you so much for joining with us this week. Until next week, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, have an amazing Father's Day weekend, maybe a founding Father's Day weekend. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.